Ooh, the Game Boy.
The approach to games was radically different. You got from 1989 to 1994, which was like ports of arcade and NES style games, plus a few Super Nintendo stuff. And then you got 1995 to like 1999, which was all like Pokemon and like 1990s licensed games. If you were to own this during the NES hype, it would be B, because it was an NES Lite.
But you gotta understand that this was the first handheld console to really have any merit that can play, like, multiple different, like, things. The Game & Watch didn't have, like, exceptional controls or music. The Game Boy could do a lot. The Game Boy could do so much more.
If I were to include Link's Awakening, I'd say it's, like, A tier, but above the NES. If you were to count, like, when you had it during the NES hype, though, it would be in a B tier. It also had, like, a decade worth of games coming out for it, whereas the NES, it was, like, 9 years, but technically it was more like 6, because no good games came out after 1991. Portability is what really wins it over for me, though. So I'd say it's like A tier, above the NES. Sega Master System. I think comparing any 8-bit console at the time that wasn't a PC to the NES is like comparing a steak to a slice of like half a hot dog. The NES was better in every category. You can't argue a single point against the NES in comparison to the Sega Master System or the Atari 7800. I'd rather own a Sega Master System than an Atari 2600. There was some cool arcade style games, because of course this is Sega we're talking about. My favorite game on the Sega Master System was Ghouls and Ghosts, the Ghouls and Ghosts port, because they actually added RPG elements to that game.
It's kind of telling that the best game in a system is a port from a superior console.
The Sega Genesis is the Sega Master System done right, if you ask me. Sega Master System.
Put it in C tier and shut it up.
Sega Genesis. I'm gonna be controversial on the spot here. I don't think it's as good as the NES.
I do think it's a better console.
Talk me through this.
This is about to get violent. For the time, it had better, like, processing power, it had more colors, it had more... Yes, it was just a superior console in terms of actual technology. I would say that there is an argument to be made for being able to at least catch up enough for it to still stay in the top spot. I think the main drive that goes in the NES's favor is that it has better games. Because a lot of the big games people remember from the Genesis is just like, people are like, oh, it's got Sonic and nothing else. Yeah, like Comic Zone was a pretty good one. Or one that I remember from my childhood, Rocket Knight.
I like the controller design more than the Sega Genesis one. At least the 3-button controller. But I also like the NES Advantage more than the 6-button controller. It's just more comfortable. It doesn't have as many buttons, but it's more comfortable. It was more future-packed at the time. Actually, I'd say it's more future-packed now, because of the slow mode and the turbo. Sega Genesis launch would have been even crazier if it wasn't for Super Mario Bros. 3 coming out, like, at the same time. I like the NES ports of the 3 Mega Man games more than the Wily Wars compilation. Final Fantasy 1 and 3 I prefer over Phantasy Star 4, although I will admit Phantasy Star 4 is objectively better than the first Final Fantasy. Contra Hardcore is better than the original Contra. I prefer Ghosts and Goblins over Ghouls and Ghosts. I do think the Sega Genesis had better arcade ports.
The controller, I think you can defend it for the Sega Genesis because I think it made more sense for what the Sega Genesis was. Because the whole thing with the NES was that it could just, like, every single game there could be played with just those 2 buttons. It was made by Sega to import over their arcade games. There's just so much the Sega Genesis has. I think it's better than the NES. It's perfect for what it was trying to be. I don't think it's S tier. It is higher A.
I'll say above, but I have to have the edge in a compromise for another console we disagree with. TurboGrafx 16
was a 16-bit console in the era of the 8-bit.
If you're counting PC Engine games and the PC Engine CD games, you got Castlevania Rondo of Blood. You got the better version of Ghouls and Ghosts than the Sega Genesis got. Some of the greatest shoot-em-ups of all time, including like Radius 2, amazing arcade ports. You got some Zelda ripoffs that were good, and you also got Bonk games. So, top of B tier.
I don't think it gets any higher than B, though.
Vectrix? Vectrix was cool. It had, like, For its graphics, it used light diode technology, and the controller was actually, it looks pretty cool. It was definitely unique, came with its own TV and everything. With that said, name a Vectrex game, go.
I physically cannot.
I can't either.
Like, who cares if your PS5 has phenomenal graphics and amazing processing power if you can't play anything on it?
Exactly. I think it gets an E tier. Boom. Super Nintendo S tier.
It took everything that the Sega Genesis could do and then made it better.
Let's compare the SNES to the Genesis.
No real comparison here, I don't think.
The Super Nintendo, by today's standards, it just completely destroys. Let's name...
It's still a fantastic console today.
Yeah, the controller's better. Street Fighter 2 was better on the Super Nintendo. You didn't have to pay extra money for a 6-button controller. You just had it there.
It gets the one thing that all Nintendo consoles get the edge for in marketing, and that's the fact that it had phenomenal games.
Super Nintendo also introduced the X and Y buttons and the L and R shoulder buttons. But Super Nintendo, it kind of just cut off everything that made the NES controller bad, added stuff, and then increased the bar for both exponentially. And
yeah,
there's also the fact that the specs, aside from CPU speed, it trumped the Genesis. And the Genesis needed hardware add-ons like the Sega CD and 32X. The Super Nintendo has controllers where you get 6 buttons plus an arcade joystick. I know it's like more obscure, but seriously, if you want to pay extra money, just go with the Super Nintendo. Sega Genesis just lacked the depth and the artistic vision that the SNES had. Now let's get into the games.
Super Mario World, I suppose.
Chrono Trigger, Super Metroid, Final Fantasy 4 and 5 I prefer over...
Are you gonna say Final Fantasy 6?
Yeah, I don't think the SNES in S tier though. I think you guys get the gist.
I think it could be S tier, but like definitely like a lower S.
We'll put it in middle S.
Oh,
Okay,
man.
so now we went through the 16-bit consoles. So, Virtual Boy, F. Philips CDI, unless you like the Zelda CDI games, F tier. 3DO, it must be trash.
Oh, the Tiger Game Com.
F. Neo Geo, lack of arcade ports that were like worldwide known, and the price. So the Neo Geo was the most powerful console when it released, so anything that was on the Neo Geo you just physically couldn't run on Super Nintendo. Like, that's a massive plus for it. It was just so good graphically. The gameplay was amazing. It had some amazing exclusives like Metal Slug. There was also Fatal Fury, which was really good. B tier for Neo Geo, I gotta be honest.
I'd say, yeah, B tier seems at home.
I'll also put the Sega Master System here. Neo Geo Pocket, I don't know anything about it. It's not broken garbage though. It had some good, powerful games at the time.
So E tier.
And the Pocket Color, also the same thing, but C tier. It was cool how you could switch the sides of the console for different controls, but again, also want to say the same for the WonderSwan. I don't know, it didn't amount to much overall. WonderSwan Color, I'm putting here for the Final Fantasy ports, and the fact they had color. I'll actually put the Neo Geo Pocket Color above 2600 too.
The Atari Lynx. It isn't flaming garbage, but it's forgettable. Maybe not bottom of E tier. I at least knew the Vectrex by name, so just one below that, I think.
WonderSwan above the Vectra, Neo Geo Pocket over regular WonderSwan. Next is the Atari Jaguar. This was the first 64-bit console.
It didn't really feel as if it had the right to be the first 64-bit console.
It was expensive, but it was the least powerful because it came out too early. I'd rather own it than a ColecoVision, but not an Atari 5200. It's the Game Gear. There was some pretty good stuff on Game Gear. It had color and a backlit screen, which the Game Boy just failed at really miserably. It was like a good port of Streets of Rage. This console was really bulky. Aside from the port of Streets of Rage, I don't see why I would play this thing today. And I guess like one of the Sonic games.
It's another console that's just kind of okay.
It's fine.
It is not a bad console.
It's not. But the Game Boy, just by pure comfortability and games, wrecks the Game Gear. I'd say right here.
I'm a huge Sega buff. I really enjoy Sega systems. And I am the type of guy to go to heaven and back to defend Sega systems. And when it comes to the Saturn, it had some decent hardware. It ran pretty well. I have a challenge for you. Name me a single Sega Saturn game that was actually worth money.
Panzer Dragoon, That was good. 3D Sonic sucks. It had some good fighting games, and it had some good shoot 'em ups. A lot of those games were also on PS1. It also had a good port of Symphony of the Night. Like, it didn't load as well, but it had some extra content. I'd put it, like, bottom C, make a
Yeah,
compromise.
that's fair. Because you could keep it top of C because you could expend your bonus compromise thing.
I'm not wasting it on the Saturn.
Just like everyone ever said when they looked at their money and realized they could buy a Saturn.